let's talk about some of the very strongest units in the Necron Codex. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Necrons again, and I thought it'd be interesting to see what sort of units are most commonly appearing in the strongest Necron army lists. Hopefully this should be a good quick guide as to what people are running and why, and maybe a tiny bit more data driven where we're seeing what people are actually running. This one isn't really based on my opinion or anything. I literally looked through a bunch of top tournament lists, took a tally of every unit included in every list, and saw which ones appeared the most commonly across multiple Necron tournament lists. The lists themselves were from 40k Stat Center's top 4 tournament winners. I'll leave a link to their website in the video description, where Necrons have had a fair amount of success over the past few months. We'll go through the ones that didn't quite make it into the top 7, and then go through each of the top ones in turn and talk about why I think they're fielded quite so much. So out of the last 13 lists that I looked at, a fair few units appeared in 4 of the lists, and 1 appeared in 5. Kind of interestingly, one of the big bads of the Necron Codex, the Catan Shard of the Nightbringer, really doesn't seem to come up all that much. He may be very scary and hard to deal with on the table, and with ignoring invuls and his massive melee damage is pretty much an answer to any one enemy unit, but for the 370 points he just really doesn't seem to do enough to see regular competitive play. For the units that appeared in 4 lists, we have the Catacomb Command Barge. They were really quite a common sight, but they got nerfed a bit in the latest chapter approved, and now aren't being run anywhere near as regularly, people seeming to run regular Overlords instead. The other enormous Necron threat in the Silent King also didn't appear quite as much as I might have expected. He only came up out of 4 of the 14 lists, which I was kind of surprised at, seeing as he was appearing in almost every single Necron top list for a decent amount of time. I guess he is a really pretty big commitment points-wise, and while he does have amazing buffs, some decent shooting, and really annoying melee threat in making your opponent fight last, it seems that more lists than not are choosing to leave him at home as opposed to bring him along. The Technomancer is a relatively common sight as well, a great value Necron HQ choice, resurrecting a model each turn or D3 warriors, or potentially helping out nearby Canoptek units with his control node. And finally, for the ones that appeared in 4 lists, we have the Scorpec Destroyers, a solid enough destructive melee threat, with really quite a helpful stratagem to prevent them taking too much damage as they move up the board. Finally, appearing in 5 lists, and I suspect might be a bit more common in the future, is the Doomsday Arc. This thing saw a really hefty points drop in the latest chapter approved, going down to 170 points, and while its anti-tank damage is really quite random, it's a real pain to remove with quantum shielding and can put out a bunch of anti-infantry shots if anyone gets too close. I have a feeling that both Doomsday Arcs and Locust Heavy Destroyers will see a bit more play in the future, as both of them saw quite so big drops. In any case though, let's get into the top 7, the units that were included in 6 lists or more. So for the first 4 we have the units that appear in 6 lists, technically placing 7 to 4 are kind of tight, so we'll go through them in turn. First up we have the cheap Cryptothralls. They appeared in 6 lists, the little 2-man murder bucket squad, only 40 points, and perhaps pretty good as they're a great unit for doing objectives and actions without having to commit very big warrior blobs or immortals or anything to doing those. Small units certainly have a value all of their own in 9th edition, and these guys certainly do bring some other utility as well, pretty tough for the cost and regenerate wounds if they're injured but not destroyed, can make any Cryptex that you have nearby pretty much invulnerable to enemy sniper fire, and when they are nearby a Cryptek, they're just incredibly good combat for their cheap points cost. 12 decent attacks hitting on 3s is certainly nothing to ignore for only 40 points. In the strong lists, people tend to run around 1 or 2 units of them. They don't tend to be absolutely enormously spammed, but if these guys are doing the job of winning the emission by standing in table quarters or doing actions, while the rest of the Necron army gets stuck into the foe, then so much the better. Next up we come to the Scarab Swarms, again appearing in 6 lists, and I feel like the changes to the secondary objectives might have had a bit of an impact on these guys. The No Prisoners secondary now rewards killing wounds of models, not just models outright, and this means taking absolute tons of 4 wound models onto the board, means that you're giving your opponent quite a lot of points towards that if they do kill a squad or 2. In general though, Scarabs have been cheap and effective since the new Codex came out. They're cheap, tough and fast, just literally because of the high wounds that they put on the table per model. They pair really nicely with the Chronomancer, making them far tougher with a 5+ invul. And they get on incredibly well with that custom dynasty, the one that gives you a pre-game move and obsec. It is just the sort of unit that you want stepping into the middle of the board, and giving a really tough unit obsec is an absolute godsend. Alternatively, they can potentially punch a bit above their weight in Novok. The extra charge damage paired with their stratagem really isn't bad, and they do have a couple of really useful stratagems as well, allowing you to self-destruct for a few mortal wounds, or potentially allowing heroic intervention if your opponent does try and sneak an objective away from you. Generally, scarabs can be quite flexible in the way that you field them. Units of 3 can be really small, cheap annoyance units that, like cryptothralls, just take a lot more shooting than they really deserve, or you can go for the big 9 base squads and maybe support them with a chronomancer to make them really hard to remove. Talking of which, in 5th place we do have the chronomancer himself, another Necron competitive staple since we could finally buy the kit for him. He's been used in 6 of those top lists, and he still seems to be very much carrying on being used despite a small nerf to his entropic lance that now costs 10 points more, though it is still very nice shooting indeed, getting a single shot at damage d3 plus 3. Could certainly blast a character to death or something if he does get an opportunity. As Necron HQs go, he is quite cheap, and his primary purpose is giving a 5+ invul save to a really big unit. Particularly warriors and scarabs with their low saves are really quite good. In general, for how he's fielded, it does seem that people are usually still taking the entropic lance despite the points increase, and more chronomancers than not tend to bear the Veil of Darkness, the pretty much auto-include Necron relic that allows you to teleport the character and a squad across the board. It just has a great combination with that 5+ invul save, so you're both getting the squad massive movement, allowing them to strike the enemy in some way, and also making them far tougher and giving them rerolls to charges if you need it. In general, people don't tend to make very big use of the Cryptek Arcana at all. Very occasional use of those countemporal nanomines to slow down enemy units, but generally just keeping him cheap is the preferred option. In 4th place, and the last of the armies that appeared in 6 lists, are the Necron warriors themselves. I was honestly kind of surprised to see these guys not quite as ubiquitous as they were. I feel like almost every single competitive Necron list I saw previously was running these in absolute droves, either in the big blocks of 20 supported by characters, or smaller units in ghost arcs. Still though, despite not being in literally every Necron list, warriors certainly remain a very sturdy troops choice, reasonably cheap per model, really quite tough with reanimation protocols which they boost with their special rule, and objectives secured to make sure that you're scoring those primaries. Warriors almost always tend to be run with Gauss Reapers instead of Flayers in top lists, and they can be a good place to stat buffs and stratagems such as My Will Be Done from the Overlord, 5+ envoys from Chronomancers, or potentially support from Technomancers. Both small squads of 10 and big squads of 20 seem to see a fair bit of play, having one big squad of 20 and having one big squad of 20 to Veil of Darkness with the Chronomancer does seem like a very common manoeuvre. A couple of lists make use of Ghost Arcs, but they do seem to be in the minority, and most people do seem to prefer their warriors foot slogging. Next up we come to the 2 units that appeared in 7 lists, slightly edging out the other selections. In 3rd place we have the Necron Overlord, who seems to be a really common staple character, and interesting that he's appearing more than Chronomancers now. Perhaps he's just a bit more prevalent to be run on foot ever since the Catacomb Command Barge was nerfed. As Overlords go, they're at least relatively cheap and effective faction leaders, without having to shell out for the whole cost of the barge. They give you My Will Be Done and Relentless March, really quite nice to have at the heart of any sort of infantry formation, and they do pack a little bit of melee threat themselves as well, often with a war scythe, and perhaps buffed by various warlord traits or relics. Typically people seem to either go down a very fighty Overlord build or a more buffing style one. Using the Void Scythe plus the Eternal Madness warlord trait is certainly a good way to make him punch a bit harder, particularly if you choose to upgrade to the Void Reaper. Otherwise, the Orb of Eternity Resurrection Orb is a common staple. That's the one that allows you to roll reanimation protocols again, but on a +1, so hopefully standing up half of a damaged unit to fight anew. Next, and the other very common staple featuring in 7 lists, are the Lich Guard, and really seem to be an incredibly common core of a Necron army. Lich Guard are ridiculously tough, with 2 wounds, toughness 5, and a 4+ invul. Sorry, it certainly is a 4+ with those dispersion shields, not a 5+. And being a ridiculously tanky unit, again pairs very well with those dynasties that give you obsec and pre-game moves. Though Novox certainly isn't going to be bad for them either, just for raw melee threat. I'd argue Lich Guard are perhaps one of the biggest and most dangerous core units you can make, so if you're ever going to support them with things like stratagems or character buffs, you're going to get some pretty amazing value here. They seem to be a popular choice for the Silent King's rerolls, or even just My Will Be Done. I'm afraid there really isn't any love for the war scythes out there. All the units that I saw were armed with hyperphase swords and shields. They might not hit as spectacularly hard, but they're far more difficult to remove with that 4+ invul and 2+ save. In general, people tend to be running Lich Guards as big 10-man units, all the better to make slightly better use of reanimation protocols, and again any 1-unit character buffs. A couple of people are running them as smaller 5-man units, maybe just for their sheer resilience when standing on and defending objectives. In any case, they seem like a fairly hard unit to go too far wrong with, very much epitomising the knight style of play of slogging up determinedly to the centre of the board and holding it against all comers. Finally, first by the ranking of this list, and used in 8 out of the 13 lists that I looked at, are the Necron Immortals. I did find it really quite interesting that these guys are now seeing more use than warriors, maybe partly with a desire just to spend less points on troops and save it for as many heavy hitters as possible. In any case, as the cheapest troop slot, Immortals are always going to have a bit of a place, 85 points per squad, and while costing a bit more per squad, they do get better toughness, a better save, stronger weapons, and more attacks in combat. I did do a Necron Warriors vs Immortals comparison video a little while back, where I took a bit of a look at their damage and durability, and they are generally really quite well balanced. I'm not entirely sure what's tipping the balance in favour of the Immortals these days. Maybe people are seeing better saves or longer range as a bit stronger in the current meta. In any case, despite the recent points cut to Tesla, people still seem to be preferring Gauss out of the two. Generally 2 or 3 units of Immortals in a list is quite a common sight, and often mixing squad size, some units of 5, some units of 10. I guess similarly to Warriors, the 5-man squads can be quite good for just holding down objectives cheaply, and perhaps filling out troop slots for battalions, where the 10-man squads can benefit from character buffs and things, and maybe things like resurrection orbs. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed a bit of discussion of some of the strongest Necron options, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on the relative strength of the units down in the comments below. I must admit it was quite fun to see what people are actually using in the strongest lists, to see what sort of things from theory are really being put into practice. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the 40k videos coming, with new stuff coming out near enough every day. Finally, if you are enjoying regularly, I'd just like to mention one way in which you can support the channel, which is my Element Games affiliate link, which you can find down in the video description below. If you were thinking about picking up some Necrons, or any other 40k minis or books, Element Games is a cheap discount retailer in the UK, with a big 10 to 20% off Games Workshop's products. If you click through on the link in the video description, anything that you buy after clicking that doesn't cost you any more, but a small amount goes to help support Auspex Tactics, so it can be a good way to support on things that you would have bought anyway. For people in the USA and Canada, there is also an Amazon affiliate link down there as well. Again, that works just the same. Click the link, literally buy anything that you would have done anyway on Amazon, and a small amount goes to help support Auspex Tactics. A big thank you to you guys who have been using those, it really does help out quite a lot. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.